Hi, I'm Tommy, and I'm a professional paleontologist. By day, I use the latest data science techniques to reconstruct ecological and evolutionary changes from the fossil record. But by night, I investigate cryptids, the paranormal, mediumship, the occult, politics, history, philosophy, and even God himself. You know, all the things that good little scientists are supposed to avoid. If you want to join me on my journey, friend, be so kind as to like and subscribe. And welcome to Creepy Puppets Presents. Hi, I'm Tommy. Welcome to Creepy Puppets Presents. I mentioned in a previous video on ABA therapy, ABA horror survival stories, that I am an ABA survivor, and I also mentioned that I thought ABA was a cult. The camera and the thing I'm reading from are in different spots, so it's not going to be necessarily easy for me to keep my eye on the camera. I have to find a more efficient camera setup. Now, if you're unfamiliar with ABA, ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis Therapy. It is a dangerous, bigoted pseudoscience, and I, as a person who is on the autism spectrum myself, I'm a survivor of ABA, and I developed PTSD as a consequence of 5 years of ABA. I had it 4 to 6 hours a week from the ages of 10 to 15. And, I can't imagine what it's like to be 2 and getting it 40 hours a week. So I wanted to back up my claim that I think ABA is a cult. And so one increasingly popular metric for cult studies is the BITE model, developed by Stephen Hassan. The BITE model lists 49 points that are commonly found in toxic and dangerous cults, and I do mean sociological cults, none of that theological cult nonsense. So I thought we'd go through this and see how many of these cult boxes ABA therapy ticks. Now, in the case of ABA victimization, there are 3 groups of people that it does this to, because first you have to get the parents involved. They're the primary clients. Then there's the patient of ABA, and I think in many cases therapists who are inducted into the ABA cult to evangelize, to spread the gospel of ABA, who are also victimized by some of these same processes. So some of these will apply to therapists, especially young therapists who have been brought in. Some of these will apply to parents, and some of these will apply to children themselves who have been afflicted with ABA. So a lot of this is going to come from my personal experience and the experience of others I've listened to, but others will come from sort of more systemic research. So we're going to start with the B in the BITE model, and that's behavioral control. And quite unsurprisingly, ABA is going to tick off a lot of behavior control boxes. So regulating the physical reality of the individual, dictating when, where, how the member lives and associates with. These are things that ABA therapists very much do to autistic children. Controls when and how and with whom the member has sex. Well, this applies, I think, to children who are sort of upper teenagers when they're still part of the ABA process. And, it's important. Sexual education is important. But I feel like there's a lack of application to this sort of thing when you're talking about, like, we know, for example, that autistic people are more likely to be LGBT, and the therapist may exert undue influence in the choice of sexual options and control the sexual education the teenager receives, often to the bias of parents and to the therapist's own personal tastes. Control the types of clothing and hairstyles? Yes. So this is often related to autistic people having a very eccentric sense of style that is often rooted toward comfort, because clothes can be physically painful. And so the ABA therapist and parents under the influence of ABA may try to enforce fashion choices on the autistic child, even if that causes pain. Regulating diet? Well, occasionally people may have food sensitivity issues. The textures of certain foods repulse them, and they may feel very uncomfortable with certain foods. And the ABA therapist will frequently try to pressure the child to consume foods they are uncomfortable with. Manipulation and deprivation of sleep? No, unless you have some kind of problem with your sleep, which is something that a lot of people or young autistic people may have problems with a conventional sleep schedule. You know, they may try to pressure them there, but usually don't do it through sleep deprivation. Number 8, this one seems like a big one. Restrict leisure, entertainment, and vacation time. So things that autistic people enjoy, which includes self-stimming behavior, like that, or their own hobbies, which may include like a favorite TV show or favorite game. Those are seen as sort of being wastes of time, as not effective uses of the time, even though they're enjoyable to us. And in the case of special interests, I've talked about before how ABA therapists will often point that having restricted interests sort of marks you out as autistic, and so that's often the thing that they try to correct. Major time spent in group indoctrination rituals. Well, if you're spending 40 hours a week being indoctrinated into the behavior that the ABA therapist thinks you should have, then yes. Permission required for major decisions? Yeah, especially after the child turns 18 and is no longer legally obligated to listen to what parents and ABA therapists want to say. ABA therapists may, before that, spend extra time trying to condition the child to influence what life decisions they make. And they may often, and parents may often advocate for loss of your legal autonomy. They may push for custodianships, which are terribly complicated legal issues, completely separate discussion. You are expected to report your thoughts and feelings. They'll press you on how you're feeling if you're well enough to communicate. They want to know what you're thinking when you're angry. They're desperate to know, because they think as therapists that they're obligated to know your mental state, whereas like when you're an adult and you contract with a therapist, you're volunteering to share your feelings. In ABA, your feelings are very often forced. Rewards and punishments used to modify behavior, both positive and negative. Ding, ding, ding! That's ABA in a nutshell. Discourage individualism, encourage groupthink. Yes, especially when it comes to how they think you should think, and trying to encourage you to think like your peers. Impose rigid rules and regulations. This is an interesting subversion, but I still think it counts. So autistic people like to have rules and regulations to help them feel safe and comfortable, but often the ABA therapist will impose rules and regulations onto the child. So for example, you can only stim for an hour a day in your room, or you can only discuss, I don't know, Pokemon for one conversation a day. Punish disobedience by beating, torturing, burning, cutting, rape, or tattooing, branding. ABA doesn't usually do this unless you're talking about the version with aversives. But this is a common miscommunication between the autistic community and the ABA world. Things that ABA therapists want autistic people to do is physically painful for them. So stopping stimming, forced eye contact, that can all be incredibly painful. So in a way, you're punishing them and rewarding them for behavior they find is painful, so it's a kind of meta punishment. Harm family or friends. Well, there have been cases of parents who decide to stop ABA for whom the therapist called Child Protective Services. Force individuals to rape or be raped? No. Instill dependency and obedience. They instill dependency and obedience in the parents and in the child. They make the child essentially unable to consent to any particular thing on their own because any disagreement is seen as disobedience. And they'll often tell the parents, well, you have to do 40 hours a week because if you don't, well, you're a bad parent. And by the way, we might call Child Protective Services on you. Encourage or engage in corporal punishment. Again, that depends on the therapist whether or not they believe in aversives. So, transforming ourselves over to the information control section, the I in the BITE model. This applies, I think, mostly to parents and to new ABA professionals. So, deliberately withhold information, distort information to make it more accessible, systematically lie to the cult members. If you're an ABA therapist or you're a parent of a child in ABA, have they told you about the Kupferstein study that found that nearly 2 out of 3 autistic people exposed to ABA will develop PTSD as adults? Have they told you about the control issues with the existing studies and the definition of metrics? Going forward, if you're watching this video now, any time after it's created, did they tell you about the Department of Defense study that found no correlation between amount of ABA and results? So minimize or discourage access to non-cult sources of information. So they do this, and often what they'll do is they'll do it by diminishing criticism of ABA. Some adults on the spectrum who are very high functioning don't like ABA, when in fact the majority of autistic people hate ABA and want it banned. Compartmentalize information into outsider and insider doctrine. Yes, they absolutely do this. They have an impenetrable system of vocabulary. You can go watch Autism Live, which is a horrible ABA promoting channel, go through. They have a series of videos just describing the absurd jargon of the ABA community. Encourage spying on other members. I'm not entirely sure if they do that or not. I do know that there is a kind of ethical system where ABA therapists are supposed to defend the institution, which might constitute a buddy system. Extensive use of cult-generated information and propaganda. Yes, I mean, most ABA studies are published in ABA journals and then distributed to ABA students and then to parents. Yes. Unethical use of confessions. Again, this applies to the sort of forced disclosure of the feelings of autistic people in the setting and to try to make them feel guilty for thoughts or feelings they have. So, on to the T in the BITE, thought control. Require members to internalize the group's doctrine as truth. Yes. Autism is bad, your behavior is bad, you need to be like your neurotypical peers. Changing a person's name and identity. Well, they don't do so much the changing of the name, but we have to have a detailed conversation about autistic recovery and the idea of recovered from autism as an identity that ABA does promote. And so after a person has received a certain amount of ABA, they receive this new identity of recovered. So that appears to be something that we can sort of count them on. Encourage only good and proper thoughts. These are supposed to be thoughts about how good the ABA is and how there are no valid criticisms of ABA, or how they're just bad ABA that they received, or if you're the autistic person yourself, that, again, your autisticness is bad and needs to be oriented toward uh, neurotypical thoughts, and it's very similar to you're not allowed to discuss neurodiversity materials which promote autism as a separate way of being. Teaching thought-stopping techniques, which shut down reality testing. Um, so I think this has to do in part with the sort of repetitive behavior and reinforcement. Don't think for yourself, just do. Don't think about whether this action is something you should have the right to consent to or not, because you're bad and you're in a bad place and you need to conform your behavior to good behavior, which is neurotypical behavior. Rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, or constructive criticism. Big rejection of criticism, and thinking for yourself as an autistic person is highly discouraged in ABA. Forbid critical questions about the doctrine. Hoo boy. Okay, that's interesting. I can't seem to scroll down all the way. Forbid critical questions about the doctrine, leader, policy. Again, ABA therapists aren't supposed to criticize. Parents aren't supposed to criticize where they might get their kids taken away. And, the autistic patient is definitely not supposed to criticize. They're supposed to do what they're told. Labeling alternative belief systems as illegitimate, evil, or not useful. And foster a new map of reality. Yes, this is the delegitimization of the suffering of autistic people. This is delegitimization of the neurodiversity movement as a fringe minority. You'll always hear some autistic people say that they're just another way of being, when no, again, we are the majority of this community and it is the majority of opinion. Going to the final area now, that of emotional control. Manipulate a narrow range of feelings. Some emotions and or needs are deemed as evil, wrong, selfish. The need to stim is evil. The need to indulge in your passions are evil. The idea that ABA itself is wrong is evil, and the idea of having thoughts and opinions outside of ABA is wrong and evil. Ding, ding, ding. Teaching emotion-stopping techniques to block feelings of hopes, homesickness, anger, or doubt. So especially with anger, right? Your anger that the world doesn't understand you, and that's bad. That's because behaviorism is a philosophy that teaches that emotions don't really exist. There's just behaviors. So you're not angry, and so anger doesn't exist in the behaviorist world, and neither does legitimate expression of righteous indignation. There's just angry behavior, and angry behavior is bad. Make the person feel that problems are always their own fault, never the group's fault. Yes, that's a lot of deflection. They'll say, well, either it's a Notri-Scotsman fallacy, it's not real ABA, or these are just unproductive people who have nothing better to do than complain. Promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, such as identity guilt. Yes, they shame you for being autistic. You're not living up to your potential. Your family is deficient. Well, your family is deficient if it's not doing ABA. Your past is suspect. In my case, this is specific to my case, the time before I was having ABA, that's time when I was sort of free to be happy. That's not good because it's not filling your time with ABA, and it's not paying the ABA therapist. Social guilt and historical guilt, the system, generally that, our entire community is bad and we're bad for wanting a redress of grievance. Instill fears of thinking independently. Yes. Yes. Thinking independently is a thing that ABA therapists don't want, because then you might not pay them if you're a parent. And thinking independently as an autistic person is really bad, because then you might think there's nothing wrong with you and the ABA therapist can stuff it. Extreme emotional highs and lows, love bombing and praise. I don't know if this is the same, but I do know that the praise and reward system used by ABA therapists comes maybe dangerously close to that. Ritualistic and sometimes public confession of sins. Yeah, that's the forcing you to disclose your thoughts even if you want to keep them private. Another big thing is I've heard a lot of autistic people describe how they would not desperately not want the therapist to know what they're interested in, because then that interest would either be punished as a special interest or would be taken away from them and they'd have to earn it back by doing so much behavior. Phobic indoctrination involving irrational fears and loving the group or questioning the leader's authority. So, for example, no happiness or fulfillment is possible outside the group. Your kid's just going to be broken if they don't get that 40 hours of ABA a week at 2, man. Terrible consequences if you leave. Hell, demonic possession. Well, terrible consequences if you leave. Your kid's gonna never be a productive member of society. Also, again, we might call the Child Protective Services on you. There's never a legitimate reason to leave, right? All the testimony from autistic adults and all the research on how it doesn't work and how it's torture, that doesn't count. Shunning of those who leave, I would say that trying to get people who leave arrested counts. And finally, threats of harm to ex-members and family. Again, that whole Child Protective Services business. So, like, that's pretty much everything on this list of dangerous cults that ABA does not do. Now, my initial count was 34, but I think I may want to increase that now. So it might be easier just to count which ones they didn't tick off. Oh, I missed financial exploitation. It's expensive and it's worthless. So, yes. So, yeah, it looks like it's only 1 or 2 of these now that I've had a chance to reevaluate it. Like, if you wanted to find a textbook cult, according to this model of cult behavior, ABA is a cult. And there's really no good argumentation around that. If you're a parent watching this and you say, I don't want to get involved in ABA, or I'm saying to myself, I'm really conflicted. I hear all this, but then my kid is going through some challenges. Look, I don't have children, and that bridge probably won't be crossed for a little while more, especially since I'm trying to finish a PhD. But I know that if I have my own biological children, there's a 70 to 90% chance that my children will also be autistic. And, I have accepted that a long time ago. And I've made the decision that if I do decide to have children, they will not receive any ABA therapy at all. Occupational therapy and speech therapy are potentially good. I had really good experience with occupational therapy right after I was diagnosed at age 5 or 6. But I will not subject my children to ABA, and I'm going to post some links in the description for alternative models of ABA behavior. All right, folks. Thank you for staying with me on this relatively long rant. Things are sort of peak crazy right now, but my hope is that within the next, by the middle of May, things will have calmed down for me, and I really want to do something more productive for anti-ABA activism. All right, folks, take care and thank you. Have a nice day.